So hello and welcome to our Spring 2024 event. I would like to thank you all for joining us. We are very fortunate, honored, and thrilled to have two very important and eminent historians of early modern South Asia with us here today. I would like to thank Professor Divya Cherian from Princeton University for agreeing to talk about her new book, Merchants of Virtue, Hindus, Muslims, and Untouchables in 18th Century South Asia. We are also grateful to Professor Chinnaiaiah Jangam from Carleton University for agreeing to be the discussant for this book and the talk. And I'm sure we are looking forward to a very fascinating scholarly discussion on issues that affect us all. Before I hand it over to Dr. Bhavya Tiwari, I would like to first thank Dr. Bhavya Tiwari, Professor of Comparative Literature and India Studies at UH. I would like to thank our supporters in the community, and then I would like to express my heartfelt gratitude to the Mutiala family and Ms. Sita Mutiala and late Bhaskar Rao Mutiala. India Studies program and our events are also made possible by the generosity of the funds from Friends of India Studies and Rangta Foundation. And this event is co-sponsored by NEH Kallan Chair in History and Medicine, Professor Pratik Chakraborty. We are thankful to Dr. Chakraborty for helping us and supporting this event. Or as you already know, this event would not have been possible with Dean Dan O'Connor. And also, this would not have been possible without the support and constant encouragement from our chair, Dr. Imran El Badawi, Chair of Modern and Classical Languages, and my colleagues, Dr. Arif Nairang, Dr. Debarati Sen, Ms. Zuleika Cruzalta, Shanika Bernes, Ms. Monica Espinoza, and Mario Soto. So I hope you enjoy the talk, and I will now hand over to Dr. Bhavya Tiwari, who is the Professor of Comparative Literature and India Studies at MCL, and look forward to the engagements and discussions. Thank you so much for joining us.
Hi, everyone. I'm Bhavya Tiwari. And those of you who know me know that this is not my voice. I have an 18-month-old who brings all kinds of bugs from her daycare, so we blame her. Anytime these days when I see a microphone and a room full of students, I am obliged to kind of, inform them about the courses that I offer here at UFH. I'm offering Cultures of India, Indian cinema, Bollywood, and beyond. I also work with the Honors College on their Frameworks Journal, which is an undergraduate research journal. So, feel free to work with me. Before I introduce the two distinguished speakers present here, I want to take this moment to recognize our India Studies Director, Shorashij Majumdar, and India Studies postdoc Arif Hayat Nairang, who have worked tirelessly on this event. Please give them a big round of applause. Thank you. I have the honor of introducing our two speakers here today. Our first speaker, Divya Cherian, is a historian of early modern and colonial South Asia with interest in social, cultural, and religious history, gender and sexuality, ethics and law, and my favorite, the local and the everyday. Her research focuses on Western India. Professor Cherian's recent book, Merchants of Virtue, Hindus, Muslims, and Untouchables in 18th Century South Asia, was published in 2023 by University of California Press. In 2022, the American Institute of Indian Studies also awarded her book the Joseph W. Elder Prize in the Indian Social Sciences. We look forward to hearing more about the book. Our second speaker, Professor Chinnaiaiah Jangam, is an associate professor in the Department of History at Carleton University, Ottawa, Canada. His research focuses on the social and intellectual history of Dalits in modern South Asia. His first book, Dalits and the Making of Modern India, was published by Oxford University Press in 2017. Most recently, his book, Gabilam, a Dalit epic, which is a work of translation and therefore of great interest to me, won the Association for Asian Studies A.K. Ramanujan's Prize for Translation in 2024. We look forward to reading that work of translation. So for today's format, I believe we have 1 hour for the event. We will give Professor Divya Cherian 25 minutes to talk about the book, and then 20 minutes to Professor Chinnaiaiah Jangam to discuss, and then we'll open the floor for our audience, so 15 minutes or so. I think I'm going to be the timekeeper, right, Sarashit? Okay, so Divya Cherian.
All right, so thank you so much, all of you, for being here. Thank you for the introduction, Bhavya, and for moderating this discussion today. Huge thanks, of course, to Chinnaiaiah Jangam for being here today and being willing to offer feedback on my book and questions for all of us to consider. Huge thanks to the India Studies Program for having me, Professor Shorashid Mojumder, and also Dr. Arif Nairang for the invitation, to Mario Soto and Shanika Barnes for all the logistics, Pratik Chakraborty for the support from the history department. And it's a real pleasure for me to be here, especially because I'm escaping some terrible weather in the Northeast, and I find myself here, reminded of warm summer days or actually spring days in New Delhi. So, thanks for all of this. So I'll just jump straight in, and I think I'd like to begin my talk today with 3 fragments that I think will be very familiar to those of you who follow South Asian or Indian news and politics, but I see many in the room who perhaps do not. So the first one is on April 10, 2014, a leading Indian newspaper, an English language paper called The Hindu, which is widely considered to be a vehicle for liberal and progressive perspectives, posted a notice on its office premises, which you can see says that there have been complaints about employees bringing non-vegetarian food. All are aware that non-vegetarian food is not permitted in our canteen as it causes discomfort to the majority of the employees who are vegetarian. It is once again reiterated that non-veg food is strictly prohibited inside our dining hall. Therefore, employees are advised to desist from bringing non-veg food into the dining halls, and it is signed by the Vice President for Human Resources. Another such set of things that I want to put before you, again very familiar to those from South Asia, is that routinely since at least the mid-2000s, news reports from Indian cities point to the emergence of vegetarian-only residential complexes. Denying someone housing on the basis of religion, caste, or sex is illegal in India, but these vegetarian-only housing complexes appear to operate in a gray area. They are particularly numerous in Mumbai and parts of Western India. And the third is the most recent one that kind of blew up in terms of public commentary in India, maybe just a few weeks ago, which is a food delivery company akin to a Grubhub here in the US, very popular in urban India, called Zomato, suddenly announced this exciting new policy in which they would essentially separate their non-veg food or non-vegetarian food delivery from their vegetarian food delivery, citing customer surveys that they had done, which suggested that vegetarians who want pure vegetarian food would be very happy with this. But there was a huge outcry because, as you will see in my presentation today, food and the vegetarian, non-vegetarian question is not just one of personal preference or ethical investment. It links closely in India with discriminations based on caste and religion. So there are these 3 before you. I would like to zoom out a little bit and provide context, which is to say, for those of you who are from India, who are of Indian origin or have spent time there, the existence of vegetarian families and vegetarian spaces is something that you will be deeply familiar with. Indeed, a majority of Indians in Western and Central India are vegetarian, even as India as a whole remains predominantly non-vegetarian, with 39% of India's 1.3 billion people identifying as vegetarian in a 2021 survey. So I will argue here today that cultures of vegetarianism in India today are not purely personal ethical choices, an expression of humanitarian disposition towards non-human beings, or inherited cultures of caste or religious community representing the diversity of India. Instead, they are an integral part of the operation of caste in India, with a history that dates back to at least the early modern period, that is the period between the 15th and 18th centuries. So now I'm diving straight into the history portion. I see a lot of people in the room who perhaps are not deeply familiar with South Asian history, but I'm also told that you are taking classes about South Asia, so I hope some of this makes sense to you. If not, obviously we do have a Q&A. So I have up here a scan of an order I found in the archive, about which I will tell you. I've transliterated it into modern Devanagari, but here's what it says in translation into English. This is from 1785, sent from the capital of this kingdom that I study to a provincial headquarters, in which the crown officers say, instruct everyone in these towns, which are, you will see at the bottom, Nagaur and Merta towns in Western India, instruct everyone in these towns to recite the name of Shri Parameshwar, which translates to the Supreme Lord, 2 ghadis into the night peher, which means about a quarter of an hour past sunset every evening. Relay this to Hindus, and the archival word, the word in the text is Hinduva, but not to the Achep, and the word in the text is untouchable castes. These being Turaks, Chamars, Dheds, Thoris, Bavris, and Halal Khors. By the order of His Highness, men from the magistracy should roam through the town daily, announcing that the name must always be recited 2 ghadis into the night peher, that is at a specific time of the evening. So I remember still the jolt I felt upon finding this command in one of my daily trudges through the records of the 18th century Jodhpur kingdom, also known as Marwar, way back in 2012. And for those who are familiar with India, probably don't need this, but this would be a little bit north of the modern Indian state of Gujarat. It would be on the border of the modern country of Pakistan, but on the India side. It's a desert region that is in Western India. This is where this place is. So this command stood out for the clarity with which it drew lines separating the subjects of the Rathod rulers of Marwar into 2, Hindus and the Achep, or untouchable. And Achep literally means untouchable. At the same time, by this point in my archival research, this decree was also in continuity with a range of shifts within the Rathod administration, Rathod being the name of the dynasty that rules this kingdom. So it was in line with a range of shifts I had seen that this administration was making in its government of social life. It was remaking the region's caste order. But what is this it that I speak of when I talk about this thing called the state? By the 18th century, the state in Marwar, as in many other polities in the region we today call Rajasthan, consisted not only of a Rajput king and his Rajput vassals, Rajputs being a caste of hereditary warriors and landlords. Rather, since the 16th century, successive Rathod kings of Marwar had begun to draw in men of the mercantile castes, known in Rajasthan by the umbrella trans-caste term of Mahajan, or great man, into their courts, as well as into the bureaucracy that they began the task of building and building out. The literacy and accounting skills of the merchants made them precisely the type of skilled group that expanding states across early modern South Asia drew upon. Elsewhere, these groups could be scribal castes or Brahmins, that is the priestly learned caste too. In Marwar, however, and Rajasthan more generally, it was the bulk of this state work, which was a diffuse sort of statecraft, fell into the hands of merchants. Kayasts, which is another caste category of the Pancholi subcaste of scribes, were also a small and active presence within the bureaucracy. While many of the merchant administrators were Jains, which is a religious community that is quite numerous, particularly in Western India. So while many of the merchant administrators were Jains, others were Vaishnavas, which are members of devotional orders centered on the worship of Vishnu's avatar, Krishna. The proliferation of these Vaishnav devotional orders was in turn also an early modern phenomenon, inseparable from the elaboration of the Mughal Empire, as scholars of Vaishnavism and the Mughal Empire have shown. The interconnections between early modern courtly cosmopolitanisms. Now, I know that's a big mouthful, but essentially there was a way of showing kind of a trans-local kingship, that I'm not just your local king, I'm a big deal, by participating in certain cultures of cosmopolitanism in early modern South Asia. The connection between that cosmopolitanism and Krishna devotion brought many Rajputs, again these warrior landed kings, including those from the ruling houses of this region of Rajasthan, into the fold of Vaishnav devotional orders. In this kingdom, Marwar, the Rathore king Maharaja Vijay Singh, who ruled from 1752 to 93, which is the entire period pretty much that I will be talking about, this king joined the Krishna-centered Vallabh Sampradaya, a particular sect, in 1764. And here he is in this image, one of many images that he commissioned depicting himself praying before the particular iconographic representation of Krishna that is favored by this devotional order. So going back to the order with which I began, in it, a court officer sought to unite a community of Hindus in a shared public ritual at a fixed time. In the same moment, the court officer sought to exclude the untouchable. But we can see that the labels themselves are not sufficient. More needs to be said to explain who is Hindu and who is most certainly not. Hindu is defined in this command as all except for Muslims, leather workers, sweepers, and certain vagrant castes, Thoris and Bavris. This I found to be the starkest expression of the nature of Hindu identity, at least from the perspective of this court in 18th century Marwar. To be Hindu was to not be untouchable, and the untouchable included the Muslim. So in my book, that is Merchants of Virtue, which, as Bhavya noted, was published in 2023, I traced the many axes along and the diffuse and localized conflicts through which this remaking of the caste order played out. The segregation of residential spaces, of water access, and of temple-centered Vaishnav ritual communities, as well as the disciplining of the Hindu self in conformity with the austere ideals of mercantile communities, and the religious paths that they most favored in Marwar, that is Jainism and Vishnu worship. Today, I will focus on one particular pathway along which the disciplining played out, the imposition as law upon all subjects of a ban on taking animal lives. Put another way, this was an imposition as law upon all subjects of the ethic of non-harm, non-violence, or ahimsa, or put in yet another way, the imposition as law on all subjects of vegetarianism. So this research is based on the Jodhpur Sanad Parwana Bahis, which are annual compilations of the rulings and decrees that the office of the ruler of at the capital at Jodhpur dispatched to its district headquarters. These Bahis are in a particular script. They can be found in the town of Bikaner in Rajasthan. I closely read over 70 volumes of these records spanning the years from 1764 to 1820. I stopped in 1820 because that's when the British incorporated this region into the expanding British colonial empire. I started in 1764 because that's when these sources begin. There isn't actually anything like them that survives prior to 1764. So in the very year that Maharaja Vijay Singh took formal affiliation with the Krishna-centered sect that I told you about, an unidentified Rathore officer issued a command on behalf of the crown to the landlord's men, to all the basic, the people, the officers in a particular village, saying the court has forbidden butchery, and yet it is occurring in that village. This is not all right. Do not permit butchery going forward. If it happens again, then the butcher's hands will be cut off and they will be punished. Now, I know this sounds very dramatic. We don't know if this was more a threat, the cutting off of the hands, but still there is this outlawing of butchery. With time, I show the Rathore state intensified its punitive efforts against the butchers, most of whom were Muslim or belonged to this category called Turak, which was listed in that record as untouchable. So 2 decades after that first order, now in 1784, yet a merchant caste officer and a scribal origin officer had all the butchers of one of the most populous towns in this kingdom, called Nagaur, picked up and jailed. Working on behalf of the king, these officers instructed the local authorities to create a structure of constant surveillance upon the butchers to ensure that they did not secretly resume their trade. They ordered subordinates in the town of Nagaur to appoint 2 butchers and 2 Brahmins to keep an eye on the butcher quarter of the town, and to make sure that they not only refrained from killing animals, but also now from owning them. Elsewhere, in the town of Pali, Mahajans, that is these merchants, banded together to pay their town's butchers 5 rupees in exchange for a commitment from the butchers to give up their trade. The memory of this effort survived into the early 19th century in a kind of an account of this same king's reign, which said in Marwadi, which I will not read to you, but the translation is, slaughterhouses were forbidden and alcohol was forbidden in the towns. And this was said in a kind of a laudatory way. Just as Rathore officers in Jodhpur persisted with an intensifying campaign to stamp out butchery, they also bore down upon communities of vagrant hunters, the Thoris and Bavris. The Thoris and Bavris, you may recall, were also listed as one among the Achepa untouchable in that first order that I shared with you. The Thoris and Bavris were caste groups that moved between settled agrarian life and the stretches of dry, arid scrub that dotted this desert region of Marwar. Sorry, just a second. They could essentially retreat to scrub, they could retreat to like faraway places that the state could not get to, and they used that mobility essentially to also have, to also be bandits, to also participate in raiding, which was something that lordly and warrior groups also did at this time. So in 1768, again, one of the orders from this kingdom blamed the Thoris and Bavris that dwelt in the countryside, in the villages, for routinely killing animals, singling them out as a community of repeat offenders against the new law banning animal slaughter. And again, just like with the merchants, we see it as, with the butchers, we see an escalation where by the late 1770s, the suspicion of these armed vagrants grows even further. The state laid down differential punishments for the same crime, that of killing animals, for members of different communities. Members of the landholding communities, so the Rajput communities, faced a temporary revocation of their land rights. Artisanal communities and other middling communities, if accused of this crime, were to pay a fine. But towards Thori and Bavri violators of the ban, the Rathore administration prescribed a different approach. So some were to have these kind of temporary and passing punishments, and then there were these people. The state ruled, which was ruled by a Vaishnav king and led by Vaishnav Jain merchant officers, decided that the ordinary residents of the Marwari countryside would now become its eyes and ears. And they made the other residents of the villages of Marwar responsible for keeping an eye on their Thori Bavri co-residents and essentially answerable for any animal that may be killed by these Thoris and Bavris, such that if an animal was killed and not reported by these, citizen surveillance people, then they would be answerable through a fine when it was time to pay a tax. Acting on this instruction, some residents of a village in Marwar called Sojat, which is underlined, I don't know if you can see, but in this map, they actually rounded up all the Thoris and Bavris that lived near their village and turned them over to the district authorities, reporting that the two groups had been killing animals. So just as with the butchers, as I said, this policy escalates over time, and we have in 1798 an order saying that they must all be expelled from the entire kingdom of Marwar, which is reiterated a few years later, in which when the state says that we've already had a round or two of expulsion of these people, but they are back, let's go for it again. The third and last group of people that faced this kind of discrimination was Muslims, who received perhaps the harshest punishment when found guilty of animal slaughter. So in the Rathore administration's handling of Muslim violators of the law as well, it is possible to discern once more an intensification over time. So in the 1760s, a Muslim who killed a goat and sold its meat was banished from the town in which he lived. His customers who were not Muslims were only fined. 20 years later, when news of their crimes reached the crown through its surveillance networks, two different groups of Muslims found guilty of killing animals were expelled from the kingdom. This included two women who were thrown out of the kingdom after already serving a lengthy 3-year prison sentence. So the campaign against animal slaughter translated into nothing less than an assault upon the dietary preferences, nutritional base, as well as aesthetic ethical and religious practices of a large swath of Marwar's population. This swath overlapped heavily with all those who had not embraced or had not been allowed to embrace Krishnite or Vaishnav devotionalism, or who were not Jain. At the same time, this swath overlapped heavily with that set of communities that constituted the domain of the untouchable or achep in the imagination of the region's elite. Butchers, Thoris, Bavris, and Muslims, members of these communities, were now considered incapable of resisting the urge or inducement to kill animals, even after they had been arrested, fined, placed under surveillance, and explicitly prohibited from doing so. And to address this, Rathod administrators prohibited in these same decades the sale of livestock to members of these communities and to anyone who was from outside the kingdom. Muslims and other low castes, Musalman Vagere Neech Jat, the crown decreed, could no longer keep herds of goats or sheep. In addition, the crown instructed officers to confiscate any livestock that were already in the possession of Muslims, Thoris, and Bavris, and to hand over these confiscated goats, sheep, cows, etc., over to members of communities that could be trusted as vegetarians. Certain peasant castes, especially the Jats and Bishnois, for those familiar with India, whose religious convictions upheld by this period a vegetarian diet, were beneficiaries of this policy. Pastoral wealth was transferred from meat-eating to vegetarian communities. So I had here yet another sort of fragment which shows that by this time, just proving that I'm Vaishnav, I have taken initiation into a Vaishnav order, was sufficient evidence to say, okay, fine, then obviously you could not have killed that animal you have been accused of killing. I also say, was going to say in more detail that, obviously what then began was a tangle of accusations. People would act out grudges against their neighbors and kin by saying, oh, well, he killed an animal, or I saw meat in his house. So for most of these petitions that I saw before the state, they ended up being unresolved, where people saying, no, I never did it, and the state being unable to prove it, or alternatively, a fine being assessed. But it appears that, it's not as though the vast majority of cases are of people of untouchable castes. People of touchable castes also could be accused, including the elite themselves, but they could always make this excuse saying, I'm Vaishnav, or have connections in the local administration and power structure to essentially get out of any kind of consequences. So it appears as though a kind of a performance of vegetarianism was sufficient for the purposes of the elite caste when it came to this ethical order. So that essentially, in terms of the things that I found and put together, for me adds up to a picture that I feel is a process in which there was a separation of those who identified and named themselves as Hindu on the one hand, and as I said and I show in the book, this correlated with other separations in residential patterns, water supply, and various other discriminatory policies that were all focused on the body and creating physical segregations. And I argue that these decades of sustained persecution and criminalization of untouchable groups for meat eating and animal slaughter were an essential element of the birth of an early modern, pre-colonial Hindu subject marked, among other means, by vegetarianism. So these findings, I argue, intervene in debates on the history of religious and caste identities in early modern and pre-colonial India, pointing out that the conceptualization of Hindu and Muslim in binary terms, as many historians of South Asia have done when looking into the pre-modern past for the presence or absence of Hindu and Muslim identities or the fuzziness between them. So this binary conception overlooks the ways in which caste informed these social identities and their operation. Through my book, I argue that in early modern pre-colonial Marwar, a Hindu identity did exist, but that its members imagined it in caste terms. With reference to caste in early modern South Asia, I argue that struggles around caste hierarchies were articulated and resolved not with reference to Brahmanical scripture, at least in this part of India, but through localized political struggles. Notions of Brahmanical purity that marked off the elite from the non-elite were one resource among many, and these too could be modified as demonstrated by the addition of a merchant-sourced vegetarianism in these centuries as a necessary component of what we may now read as Brahmanical purity. And certainly over the centuries, there had been Brahmin communities in South Asia that had taken on vegetarianism as a marker of their caste identity, but this was far from given even until recently for Brahmins in India. As we know, Kashmiri, Konkani, Bengali Brahmins are comfortable with meat eating. And at the same time, and this is a more obvious point for those who are scholars, but for those who are not scholars, one other takeaway I think from the book is today there is this kind of weaponization of the post-colonial study of caste by India's Hindu right to say that caste was a colonial construct, that there was no caste, or at least caste was kind of a benign, merit-based, occupation-based social order before colonialism. It's when colonialism comes that all the bad things start to happen. So I hope that my book pushes against that kind of public argument that is ongoing in India to show that there were aspects of oppression, persecution, and all kinds of not great things before colonialism itself. Finally, I hope that, and this perhaps is not so clear in this part of the presentation, but there are the parts in which I show the segregation between, particularly spatial segregation. I want to highlight that there was a certain power of the concept of untouchability, that it was deployed as a legal category, not just as a kind of a ritual, vague thing in these records. The book argues that the studies of pre-colonial caste that we have so far tend to focus on caste as a whole order rather than the touchable, untouchable, sort of the hardness of that line. So I instead suggest that we need to pay that special attention to the work that untouchability does in conditioning the caste order, what the idea, the figure of the untouchable does. And in doing so, I hope that this book connects to predicaments that today's India and its diaspora face, offering a genealogy of Hindu, communal, and caste identity formation, of the politics of untouchability and exclusion, its relationship with vegetarianism, the prominence of merchants in civic and political life, and of nonviolence as a political resource, which Gandhi went on to mobilize to great effect in the world. So I will stop there. That's the best I could do in a very short summary of my book. Thank you.
There is, if you want to understand caste as a category and what is the importance of caste in human history, one of the ways in which we have to look at is that how is it, the making of the modern world, not just in Indian context, but also the larger context of European colonialisms and the way in which these hierarchies and oppressions are created. So Indian caste system is a template, the template which actually exists. Europeans were puzzled, but also very happy to find the system. So in this context, before I start, I thought, I will start with this very interesting, rather shocking, in the context of, Divya also mentioned in her presentation, and how Zomato recently brought it up. But when Zomato is doing that, then Dalit boy was beaten up because touching, a water pot. So that too in a school. School is supposed to be very secular and also supposed to, do lots of things to emancipate humanity. We think about knowledge and school as where in which you're not supposed to feel discriminated, and you need to have freedom to survive, freedom to exist. So in this context, I thought, why, how do we understand caste as a very important, not as a category and structure, but also how it exists even today. And also another important thing, because in India now we have Hindu supremacist government, which is legalizing all sorts of things, taking discrimination against Muslims, Dalits, and Adivasis, and also they're systematically destroying the institutions which provided opportunities for people like me as a Dalit. I was able to go to university and schools precisely because we had positive discrimination policies which gave us constitutionally guaranteed access. So, but those are now under threat. So in this context, what we see is that, this whole idea of upper caste supremacy is getting normalized. And in this normalized and in this context, Divya's book, what it does, it shows us is that, it is not just what is happening in India as a long history that precedes colonialism. Because what happens is that, Hindu supremacists will try to tell you that, everything about past is golden past. It never, nothing, even now, there are many South Asian scholars who tries to say that caste is a complex problem. It was ethnic identity, the differences are, it's actually caste did not work like this, and all those, lots of people who provide lots of complex arguments saying that, there is a difference between Hinduism and Hindutva. That's another classic thing. Many of these progressive will come up. But, today what I talk and what I see as a Dalit person coming from the victim of caste system, for me, I don't see much difference between Hinduism and Hindutva, because they are like, twins. They cannot exist without the other. So in this context, for me, if you look at what is happening to a child in school and how Zomoto tried to do, is basically part of this long history of what actually happened in South Asia. See, in this context, what I found this, I read with a lot of interest, and because my own interest in the history of caste, my own discomfort with the existing historical scholarships. So I was looking to write something very different from what exists. So in this context, what I found, like, Divya's book is that, it's foundational in terms of, going out of this framework of blaming colonialism and also blaming that, showing that, caste is a modern phenomena. And that's what one of the important things we have to see is that, the book I'm planning to write and trying to see is that, I want to write this long durée history of caste. And I think for me, like what Divya's archives does is that, it actually makes me go one step down to look at the archive. The traditional understanding of the caste, like if you want to see, like, there are lots of non-South Asianists. I thought I will show you this image. Like this is, if you can see, yeah, like what most of the time the Brahmanical understanding of caste, people try to tell, the classical, Manusmriti and Rigveda and wherever. Look, the Brahmanical and religious notions of history in caste is that, the people in Hinduism, all castes were born from the body of the god. And there is this hierarchy in which basically people are born from different parts of the body of the god. According to that, you have social status and access to material resources. In this, what happens is that, like according to that, what happens is that, there is purity and pollution. The top you are, more pure you are. The bottom you are, the less pure. So in this context, what Divya is trying to show us is that people in the third category, the merchants, the Vaishyas, or the Banyas who are called, were trying to elevate themselves to the Brahmin status and collaborating with the Brahmins. So in this context, what happens is that, they use virtue and morality as a fundamental idea to surpass this entire caste caste architecture. So in this context, what we are seeing is that, she's challenging this understanding. What Divya's work has done to us is that, she provides this legal framework through which basically caste became an important everyday operations of the caste. And in this context, what I see is that, she provides this pre-colonial antecedents, and so one of the important argument, like, not from our book, but what I'm trying to guess and show that, for me, the way in which colonialism, this is where you have to see the interesting relationship between race and caste. For me, in 15th century, when Europeans have landed in Indian subcontinent, particularly Indian Ocean world, the most of the east and west coast of India, like these are the regions from which most of the material products, like cotton, textiles, and spices, these are all very rich region in the world. And that's why basically you see that, Indian Ocean dominated the world trade in early modern world. And for me, the fundamental producers of this wealth were again oppressed caste people, untouchables and artisans and other people. So in this context, what I see is that, in fact, colonialism, what it does is that when they come in contact with caste system, which is in pre-caste, it was Jati system, one of the ways in which they try to see is that, it is the most efficient system of surplus extraction without much violence. And they don't have to do genocides the way they did in settler colonial states like North America, either Canada or United States. You see that you see mass elimination of the people. But in Indian subcontinent, instead of eliminating, they absorb the elites into the structures of colonial state. Therefore, what happens is that Indian origin people were one of the earliest people who go into Cambridge, Oxford. That's when you have all these Indians who are very successful in North America. They win Booker Prizes and all these things. They were not first generation educated. Do you understand how privileged they are? For centuries together, their families and their inheritance, they had access to education. They never even touched earth in their generations. Those are the people who are very successful. These are not, that's when a South Asian migrant story is not the story of escaping genocides or escaping civil wars and coming here and trying to make life from scratch. These are all the people, technical education, PhDs, they come here and have jobs. So in this context, if you want to see that, like how colonialism, Brahmanism and colonialism work together, and the success of British colonialism in India lies on the way in which they are able to cement this collaboration between Brahmanical elites and colonial elites. So therefore, for me, this way, what you see is that this book, what it does is that it gives this very interesting frame that, in pre-colonial context, there is a state consciously doing this. That's why, in my first slide, I said legalized segregation. What you talk about Jim Crow, it was happening in India in 17th and 18th century. What 19th century America or early 20th century America is doing, it actually was happening much 200 years before in India. So in this context, if you want to see this interconnection, intersectionality between race and caste, how basically they interact, they are not separated. So that's why you can't see European colonialism in separation from North America, or if you look at in the context of castas in Mexico, for example. Where do they come from? So in this context, I see this very interesting way in which I try to see that the caste is a very important template for racism. Therefore, you have to see this, and that's why Divya's book is very foundational for anti-caste scholars, because it forces us to see beyond modernity, see beyond colonialism, and try to look at capture caste, the way it has been legalized in the so-called pre-colonial states like Marwar. So in this context, what happens is that if you look at Marwar state and mercantile capital, modernity of caste and recrafting caste supremacy, that is very central. Like here is a, very interestingly, throughout the text, I was very surprised. Nowhere there is a reference to Manu, nowhere there is reference to Veda. All these orders are being done on the basis of virtue and trying to protect animals and this and that. They're circumventing the Brahmanical supremacy at the hierarchy to using virtue and morality as a very important thing. So that's where what you see that early modern world, the mercantile capital, because they have money, and I think this is what happens like across India, like on the eve of European colonialism, most of the native states, princes, and including Nizam of Hyderabad, they were all prisoners of mercantile capital. They were like indebted to these people so much that Nizam of Hyderabad almost went bankrupt because of these merchants in Hyderabad. So what is happening is that mercantile capital, they are basically taking over the state and trying to control it. So in this context, the early modern making of the caste, basically, the mercantile community had a very powerful role to play in reshaping the caste system. At one level, what happens is that this is also the time in which, like particularly in the context of Deccan and South India, where I come from, there are anti-caste movements, like which again parallel movements are coming up. But what you see that the Baniyas and Brahmins together are trying to rewrite the caste system, because the effective functioning of the caste is very important for them to play a very important role in global trade. But so therefore, what happens is that for them it is in their interest. That's what it's very interesting. The mercantile capital in Europe brings in industrial revolution. Like you have a very different path in Europe. Like all these explorers who are making money and bringing, and you see that the Renaissance in Europe and Reformation in Europe, the new ideas. But in India, it's going very, very differently. So in this context, what you see is that this book is a very interesting way in which it tries to demonstrate to us that, Brahmin Banias tries to rewrite the whole idea of, the social contract. So in this context, I see this very interesting connection, and this way, what you see is that, very interesting, gender is a very important frame through which this whole idea of imagination of the state happens, in which patriarchy. And so if you see the interconnection between state, mercantile capital, and patriarchy, it's a very interesting thing happening in early modern India, and it's very critical to understanding the way in which the states work. And there is some discomfort I felt, particularly the way in which the whole idea of definition of untouchable in the book. Like, at one level, what happens is that, like untouchability is a very specific experience. Like, it is like, being an untouchable is a very, very different experience from being, that's why the whole idea of graded hierarchy and graded inequality in caste system, what happens is that, for a Brahmin, everyone is an untouchable. But there is a different way of experiencing untouchability. A Shudra experiencing untouchability is very different from a Dalit. And a Muslim, for example, a lower caste Muslim might be an untouchable, but a ruling class Muslim was not considered an untouchable. So in this context, what happens is that you have all these Rajput families getting married to Muslim families, because they are political elites. So in this context, so that was very, very interesting. That's where I had, if there is anything I have to talk uncomfortableness of being, coming from, again, my own experience and my own writing, that's where I felt little bit challenging. The second thing about this whole idea of Jainism and Buddhism in history, like, what happens is that, these anti-caste movements and anti-caste narratives, people try to eulogize Buddhism and Jainism as this egalitarian religions, and untouchables were like, very attracted, all those things. But this is historically, that's what again, Divya's book shows, the Jainism, the role of Jains, Jain merchants in Brahmanizing the state and reimposing the Brahmanism. And also it happens in the context of Buddhism also. If you're familiar with, in Deccan history, particularly Shatavahanas, for example, all these Jain rulers in pre-modern world, they were not talking anything about caste system, caste injustice, because what the biggest attraction about caste and Brahmanism is that it justifies exploitation, surplus extraction, inequality, and violence. These are fundamental to any state, irrespective of religion. Anyone who wants to rule, they need to have Brahmanism by their side. So therefore, what happens is that even the Buddhist rulers were making what you call Sanskrit translations, and Jains were translating. Like, for example, earliest Telugu translations in Telugu were done by Ramayana and Mahabharata were done by Jains. So therefore, what happens is that it's very interesting to see how this whole idea of critiquing. This is my last slide. So in that context, Jainism or Buddhism are a very, very, historically, if you critically look at it from the anti-caste perspective, there is a lot of discomfort in it. And the third last point I want to make about this book is this Gandhi and race. Like many times, every time I'm reading the book, I'm thinking about Gandhi. My God, this guy, Gandhi, the whole idea of propagation of cow protection in national movement, it was Gandhi. This, that was very, very important problem with which basically Muslims are targeted. And in this context, if you there are lots of people who talk about, Gandhi is a complex person. He has like recently I was reading Akhil Biligrami. He was writing a very interesting article about, thinking about Gandhi and caste, and he says that Gandhi actually didn't believe in hierarchy of the caste. He believed in the heterogeneity of the caste. But you can't imagine caste without hierarchy. You can't imagine caste without, inequality. So in this context, like that's why, if you look at these whole, engagement, if you really want to understand Gandhi, look at what this book tells about, like Jain Vaishnav. In fact, that is greatest thing about, that's what if you read Gandhi's autobiography, he always boasts about how he has this Jain and Vaishnav heritage, and, his whole repulsion towards meat, and, all these things comes out of this tradition. And today, Amit Shah, the Home Minister of India, the violence through which, that's what in the name of animals, these people, commit so much violence. both in terms of against their own families, particularly women, and also people of other faiths and also other castes. So in this context, these are the two interesting things I was very puzzled about. Throughout the book, I was looking for Baniya word. Whether it's conscious or not, but you refused, you didn't use the word Baniya anywhere. And for me, that's a very interesting thing in the sense, the Baniya Brahmin connection and the way in which they solidify relationship both in pre-colonial world and also in the context of anti-colonial nationalism. If you look at the way in which the Indian National Congress was supported by the mercantile capital, and Baniyas played a very, very important role. So, and I was wondering, why didn't you use Baniya word? And the final thing I was thinking about, it is all there in the book, but nowhere you use this idea of intersectionality and also caste patriarchy, and how basically this reconstitution of state is central to the idea of using this central categories as a very important thing, but you don't mention about them. I will stop it here, and thank you so much again. Jai Bhim to you all.
So thank you so much, Professor Jangam, for that very rich and textured comment. And I also feel that you explained some nuances of the caste order, as well as the arguments of the book that I had neglected to share. So that I was very grateful for that. I'll jump straight to the questions that you raised. So there's this term Baniya that Professor Jangam put on the board, which is a loose term for mercantile castes, money lenders. I didn't use it. I think part of my strategy for this book came from sometimes this awareness that I felt like I need to stay close to my sources, close to the vocabulary and language of the sources. And I didn't want to slip away from that at all. Because then people might say, oh, you're putting Hindu where that word Hindu is not there. That's your interpretation. Or you're putting, some other term where it. So for me, that was just something I did, is to stick as close as possible to the terminology. I think that's why the word Baniya just doesn't come up in these sources. It is very interesting. There is this because among mercantile communities there actually are subcastes with names that sometimes correlate with last names. And they, in fact, determine things like marriage and all of that. It's not just random family last names. But they do seem to have consolidated even before the period that my sources begin into this legible category called Mahajan, which operates like a caste identifier, as though it is one caste, especially in their dealings with the state. So I went with that term Mahajan because I felt it was more reflective. But yes, you're right, maybe when I zoomed out and tried to link to, as I do in the epilogue or the introduction, I could have used the word Baniya. Maybe that was my way of stepping away from, and maybe I was misplaced in that, but like polemics or something, I didn't want it to. I felt if I made it what might be read as sloganeering, then people may not take the scholarship that seriously. But maybe, that's something I should have considered. On the intersectionality question, I think it again came from the same impulse. Maybe somewhere I felt like, one of sort of the writerly, this is for those of you who write, one of the writerly suggestions to me was show, not tell. So, show. And that's sufficient. But maybe I should have showed and told, as in I felt that I'm making the case and intersectionality is sort of well understood today as an argument in scholarly circles. So maybe I felt like it was obvious or something. But to be honest, I did not actively think about, it's not an active choice I made. I thought it was clear, but again, maybe that's something I should have pulled together the end or the beginning. And then actually, I think you have a third question, which is, something that I've considered a lot, and I'm also asked a lot, which is that these legal categories are projecting onto the world this binary between Hindu and untouchable, right? And I think the discomfort you expressed goes to is that history, or are those projections of a certain understanding of an idealized order that this state is trying to impose through its legal regime, but the legal regime does not encompass reality. There is a whole world outside these records. So I don't now remember if I've ever clarified this in the book itself, but I always try to address this by saying just because these orders say that all Muslims are untouchable, in lived history that would be more complicated because there would be some elite Muslims as well. Just because you call them untouchable does not actually make them banished and outcasts, right? But that said, I think Marwar, this region, actually did not have very many elite Muslims, and the thing you pointed out of Rajputs marrying elite Muslims stops by the 17th century. So there's a medieval practice where Rajputs are very comfortable marrying with Muslim ruling elites. But in the course of the early modern period, the more elite Rajput caste stop that practice, and they in fact start treating their Muslim Rajput cousins as not like they would not include them in smoking the hookah pipe, which is a type of caste inclusion. So there's a study which shows that kind of slow exclusion of Muslim Rajputs in Rajasthan. So yes, I would say there is a complexity outside. I think for me, I found this vision itself so stark. And the fact that this is not in just some prescriptive text or some literary chronicle, or that this is in like petition, in response to petitions that come from subjects or orders that are sent out, or in response to surveillance reports to which. So I found that starkness itself so new and alarming, and I think I wanted to bring the book forward, bringing out to readers that this is the vision from this perspective, which is not just some random person, like one guy's book. This is a full legal order with the participation of regional elites. So I think that is why I didn't nuance or complicate it too much. But again, I think there's more to talk about there, but I'll stop.
And thank you, Dr. Jangam, for your excellent presentations, really. My particular bone to pick with Dr. Jangam and Gandhi and untouchability will happen later. We cannot do it here. But with Divya, I have particularly after Chinnaiaiah's excellent and, if I may say so, inspiring presentation, I feel like somewhat like a nitpicking scribe from one of your records in asking this question. But nonetheless, it seems like it might do to an accountant slightly important to square up the ledgers. The account that you've drawn, the trajectory that you've made is sort of familiar in Gujarat also. Vaishnavism, encroaching Vaishnavism, particularly in the early 19th century with the Swaminarayan sect, and the lesser Rajputs, like the Katis, who all converted to the Vallabh sect and so on, and their Vaishnavism, and their eschewing of opium, alcohol, and meat, and so on. So I can see a familiar trajectory. However, it seems to me from your entire text, not just your presentation, that there is something of an inevitability about the transition to the Baniya Rajput or Baniya Brahman Rajput alliance, which we see so clearly in the colonial period in the 19th and in the 20th century. But remember, in your period, we are really in the mid-18th century. We are in the period where you yourself have referred to portfolio capitalists. Now, portfolio capitalists, whether they are, in Hyderabad or whether they are in Awadh, whether they are in Multan or whether they are in Calcutta. And I'm quite aware that many of them were Brahmins, but this trajectory of Brahman Rajput or Brahman state, if you like, not even Rajput, Brahman state, any Nawabi alliance for that matter, was not inevitable. Scribal culture was entrenched in, for instance, Awadh. And we have seen a huge number of writings on Awadh scribal cultures in South Asia in recent times. And not just in Awadh. Scribal cultures were predominant because of the Mughals and because of the state, Mughal state itself. Scribal cultures were prevalent in several other communities than the merchant communities that you speak of. Similarly, revenue administration as well as financing of not just collection of revenue, but military, what do you call it? Fiscal military state, financing of the fiscal military state, yes. That was done not just by what you would call the Mahajans, right? Yeah. I can name Afghans, I can name Arabs, not to speak of all the myriad people who did it for the entire Maratha compendium all over the Dakhin, right? So, what seems to you, I beg your pardon, I just talk too much. My students complain, I'll stop. What I'm saying is what seems to me, or to us, to be an inevitable trajectory of what we see today.
Yeah.
The Brahman Baniya state alliance, it was perhaps not quite so inevitable. Did you intend to project it that way? Were there other roads possible?
Divya, do you want to answer that question?
Yes, thank you. So yeah, absolutely, and I think I also thought about this issue. First of all, I think what I try to say is this is happening in, so it's the epilogue where I get to this. My story is a very internal to Marwar story. However, going to the portfolio, this is very internal to the people who don't read South Asian history closely. The portfolio capitalist argument actually distinguishes between the South Indian and Bengali coast portfolio capitalists and the North Indian ones, where the mercantile money lending firm plays a unique role in North India that it does not in coastal India. And those mercantile money lending firms are, by the 18th century, predominantly Marwadi. So there is a uniqueness to the Marwadi where it's not just the petty Afghan money lender or even just the scribal kayast sitting in Patna. This person is part of these trans-regionally situated mercantile and money lending networks that have cornered the big money lending market in a way these other players haven't. That said, what I do argue is that this is not inevitable. So for me, the answer to that question lies in the 19th century, where what happens next is the play of history, which is because these guys are scattered as they are, and they have become key players in politics as well, they even further cement the kind of role that they have and go on to have the kind of dominance that they then do. So that story, for that story, the answer is the 19th century, and frankly, others have already written it. So I'm offering a prehistory to what kind of cultures these people bring to the dominance that they come to have, first of all. And second of all, the other prehistory I'm offering is to the kind of locally organized pressure activity that these merchants do, again studied for the 19th century by Chris Bailey for small town Uttar Pradesh, where he is referring to Marwadi or Marwadi identifying merchants as acting collectively, putting pressure on local governments to say, let us remake this public space, let us introduce these public things, and that kind of collective action that is visible at the micro scale back home in Marwar in the 18th century, I am arguing can they export it outside, and that kind of relationship that they had with the state. So for me, no, it is not inevitable, although the one thing that sets them apart from all of these others by the start of the 19th century is the kind of hold that they have on a whole other scale of finance, combined with everything that happens in the 19th century. So
this action when the whole industry was displaced and the whole market was closed, and a lot of means of production changed their owners in one period in one region, sounds kind of like very radical thing. So what had happened there? What led to this radicalization of relations between vegetarians and people consuming meat?
And the second question?
Yeah, and the second question for Dr. Jangam. Just today, early morning, I was reading Soviet Marxist archaeologists who were thinking about how colonization absorbed the local elites and integrated them in the systems, which sound very close to what you told. And I know that kind of a lot of Soviet literature was translated to Indian languages in the second half of 20th century. So it's just kind of methodological questions. What are your sources of inspiration? Is it Western literature? Is it somehow connected to Soviet thought, or its local tradition? So what is your intellectual background? Thank you.
Thank you. I don't know your name, but thank you so much for that question. Regarding the context of Soviet Union and what is its influence on India. We grew up on Soviet translations. And I remember, even in high school, I read Amma, one of the mother, Maxim Gorky's. So like that, the context, Soviet Union had, particularly till its collapse, and I think that was the case with most of the regional languages in India, where Soviet translations were available. But other than that, because my inspiration in the sense, I am a Dalit. So I come from the context in which, it was like I am the first generation educated. And for us, it was, but for the state institutions, we would not have been, I would not have been here. So in this context, for me, it's not just an intellectual enterprise what I do, it's also personal. And I see my own emancipation with my own people, and in that context, it's my social responsibility to write. So.
Very quickly, in terms of what happened leading to this kind of antagonism between vegetarians and non-vegetarians, I think actually Chinnaiaiah's presentation spoke to that part of my story, which you're right, I didn't clearly say in this presentation. What I argue is, so first of all, this vegetarian ethic I attribute in my presentation to this new Krishna-centric sects that emerged in the course of the 16th century and that become wildly popular across North India and Western India, which is my part of the world, and they also become associated with a kind of elite kingship among Hindu kings, right? That was one piece of the story. But even before that, from the medieval period itself, Jainism, which is this other religion that is very, very influential, particularly among mercantile communities in Western India, then and now, demands a vegetarian ethic, and an ethic of non-harm from its adherents. So those two things are already well in place, one much longer than the other by the time you reach the mid-18th century, which is where my story begins. So what I suggest is that while the ethics are not new, they're embraced and by a wider set of people than just the merchants. So some of the ruling Rajputs, their association with a kind of cosmopolitan identity, those things have happened. But particularly these merchants have a stronger grasp on worldly power, like this worldly power in the form of their hold on finance, and for which the 18th century is the peak. Not even I would say a big moment for them. Maybe even the early 19th century is more of a peak. But they have this kind of hold on money, which is not just a transnational hold, but also a hold within the kingdom. But secondly, they also have a kind of political power that is unique to this kingdom because, unlike in other places that Professor Chatterjee here was mentioning, they are deeply part of the administration, and not just as scribes and bureaucrats, but they are ministers, like prime ministers. They are like major, courtly nobles. They are not just office holders. So that change allows them to push for a kind of effort to remake their place in the social rank, which is what Professor Jangam very nicely showed in that pyramid. They're actually in that pyramid, number 3. How do you go from number 3 to number 1? So I argue that they use this currency of virtue, morality, ethics to remake what it means to be number 1, to now demand vegetarianism, which, by the way, is not actually required of 1 or 2 coming into this period. But by the end of this period, 1, 2, and 3 in this region are vegetarianism is an important aspect of us being at the top. So for me, it's not easy to remake the ideological basis of a caste order or its material manifestation, and these kinds of struggles help to normalize and universalize what was until then a caste ethic.
So I just wanted to start with thanking both Divya and Chinnaiaiah for coming to Houston and presenting your research. We don't have a massive South Asian group, but you can see that there is enough interest, so thank you for your presentations. And Chinnaiaiah, very nice to see you after many years. People who do not know, we studied in the same university, so it's very nice to see him after several years. So Divya, I have not read your book, so it's probably an unfair question by that very virtue, but I'm very interested to read that. So it seems your project is on the 18th century. And there is my question. So because the 18th century, as you know, in the South Asian history, is a massively debated period, particularly for some of the points that you discussed, like rise of mercantile capitalism, the fiscal military state, the rise of the Baniya community in all that category. Now, if the focus is on that period and the rise of the mercantile community and the alliance with the Brahminical community itself, does the story carry the risk of appearing as a product of our caste or this caste model, the Hindutva or Hindu caste model, as we see, is a product of the 18th century mercantile capitalism rather than of caste itself? So does it become a problematic outside caste system because of the political economy of mercantile capitalism? Or does it not remain a problem of caste, which is the point that Chinnaiaiah was suggesting, that caste has had a long pre-colonial, long-enduring presence. this appears a very 18th century story to me, which is quote unquote pre-colonial. So,
Okay, thank you for the question. I mean, I'll keep it short, which is I will say that why would you separate caste from capital? Is there an idea that capital comes from outside? Is there an idea that the economic is entirely distinct from the social or the cultural? Is it not that capitalism, first of all, it is well known, I think, for since the intervention perhaps of, depending on if one agrees with him, say Frank Perlin, and actually some early Soviet writers in the 70s, that there is this theorization of the birth of capitalism as in the course of the early modern centuries as a global phenomenon. And there is a kind of retroactive erasure of those roots to say, boom, 18th century industrial capital or whatever, these companies are doing some, octopus-like whatever work outside of Europe. But the other understanding, which is my understanding, is that the early modern period is a global, sees global geographies of capital with different levels of like intense participation in this emergent world. And so caste is, as that story or other forms of embodied difference, as they play out in different parts of the world, are part of the story of capital. How can you separate race from the story of capital? Similarly, you cannot separate caste from the story of capital. So what you see in the 18th century are particular new dynamics in which caste is also playing a role. But in fact, what you ask is one of the hopes of my book. It's in the introduction as well, that I want to put the caste into the story of early modernity, by which I mean early modern global capital, but also I want to put caste into early modernity because histories of early modern South Asia tend to be remarkably silent on caste. Either the question is, what is the pre-colonial, pre-modern history of caste, or there's various early modern, or this and early modern that books. Now, they're not all. There is a body, I think Kumkum Chatterjee, Rosalind O'Hanlon, but they have tended to look at like one caste or the other, scribal participation, Brahmin participation. So I think, that's where I was going with that. And as to the pre-colonial, I also understand that parts of India start to be colonized. But I think for me, it was significant for the reasons that I highlighted in my presentation, that for now, even though this world, going back to the first 3/4 of my answer, cannot be separated from colonialism as it is playing out. In fact, in South Asia, with the arrival of the Portuguese in 1490, whatever it was, 28, I should know this, 1498. So it's not pre-colonial in that sense, but that this polity is ruled by, and it's in actually what is still a somewhat removed area from where the British English East India Company is operating. That was important to me just to make an intervention. Otherwise, in this colonialism, this and colonialism, that, which I'm not rejecting, but that's where I would go.
Thank you so much, Divya and Chinnaiaiah, for a wonderful talk. So I had a question about, in your, Divya, in your book, you write about, this is a particular word that has struck me and remained with me, is that social creditworthiness, right? And so it seems that, we are talking about finance, we are talking about mercantile capitalism. So it seems that there is already an idea of risk, right? But then I think, what is the vernacular idea of risk, and how does this idea of risk play out in forming, consolidating the caste relationships, right? I think, so the moment we talk about risk, we are talking about in terms of quantifying social characteristics and so on, and right? So we are not only talking about purity pollution simply, but we are linking purity pollution with other things such as health, etc., right? And so I was wondering, so that is, and I think I was looking for more material on risk, right? Because if you talk about social creditworthiness, then, I think it is in one of those later chapters that you talk about social creditworthiness. So that would be, if you could kind of elaborate a little bit about how, if there was any idea of risk that shaped this caste as it emerged.
That's a good question, and I don't know if I have fully thought through it. I mean, the easy answer for me, it would be to remain within the framework of the book, and there I think the particular language that I draw, which in fact I make, I think, clear in the book, is based on 19th century scholarship, because I didn't have in my sources those concerns with creditworthiness expressed in quite the same way. So I turned to Douglas Haynes, who's a historian of Gujarat and capitalism in 19th century Gujarat. I turned to his work to try to make sense of it. So I only refer to it in that way. But if I were to go there, one concept that is sometimes invoked, but I find it invoked in many contexts, not just the mercantile context, is that of abru, where abru, I don't know quite how to translate it, it means something like pride or dignity or something like that. And so abru, I think, and Douglas Haynes picks up on it as well. I think he relates it to things like charitable giving, community feasts, philanthropy, and actually the setting up of animal hospitals as being a very crucial component of that kind of building up your dignity, right? And so the flip side of that, if I again was to think through my own work, would be reputational damage, where I do actually point to, within the kind of vegetarianism thing, there are a few, in the second half of the book is about the construction of the Hindu self. So there I have cases where somebody is accused, I forget of what particular infraction in this moral framework, but I think it's meat eating. So where he starts to be called names and people dig a pit in front of his house as a form of punishment, and then water starts to collect in front of it. And his whole thing is, I never did the thing I'm being accused of, and he doesn't go to the point of this is causing me risk as a businessman. But I think this kind of departure from the ethical norms expected of a mercantile person, which was gendered, as Chinnaiaiah rightly pointed out, so a deviation from kind of chaste behavior for both men and women, but in this legal regime, it is the woman chapter that shows up as a demonization and, in fact, criminalization of abortion, where the deviant behavior of a woman is, in fact, reflective of the lack of male control on her. And that I found truly remarkable, and I don't even know if it's replicated in other kingdoms of Marwar, that it's the women are not punished for deviant sex or abortions. Actually, for abortions, they can be punished, but for deviant sex, the men are punished. Including their own male guardians for not keeping the women under control. So I think this, being accused of eating meat, being accused of drinking, and then being accused of sort of unchaste behavior, these do form a type of risk, I would say, within the framework of the book. But I didn't have clear articulations of like, this has caused me reputational damage. So I think that would be a slightly more speculative part of the book.
Yes. I'm looking forward to read the book of Divya Cherian, and we have read only the introduction so far. I'm looking forward to read more. My question is for Dr. Jangam. So in your discussion, you were it was very interesting. You were connecting the element of caste question with the racial segregation in Jim Crow South. One such idea that I got obsessed in this semester is the idea of how the caste and race has been used in the historiography, both in America and in India. So specifically, if you look at the context in like 1930s, how the whole caste school emerged in US, how it was made to downplay the idea of class struggles, how it has been used as an element of language of caste in the US South, specifically during Jim Crow segregation. And like scholars like Trinitarian black Marxist scholars like Oliver Cox were trying to critique all these things. And now there is again a revival of caste school in 2010, like late 21st century. But how do you look, like us from the Indian perspective, how do you see this race and caste question? Like there is an idea of social struggle, the idea of solidarity that is going on one side, but using these frameworks, how compatible they are when it comes to the structure, and that's my question, and I just want to know your.
Thank you for this question. And yeah, one of the things why I wanted to write this long duration history of caste, and I see very interesting thing, particularly the making of modern world and how basically racialization most of the time seen in isolation from caste. But if you look at from 16th century onwards, the Europeans' encounter with Europe, Indian subcontinent, is the obsession they had with Sanskrit. And if you look at the number of Enlightenment philosophers who are reading Sanskrit texts in translation is unbelievable, particularly the German and French. English come afterwards. So in this context, there is this very interesting essay by Anna Harit. It's called Race Before Racism, where, very interestingly, she talks about how the French elite, when they want to differentiate themselves from the peasants, one of the ways in which the category they use, in fact, is caste. And that's when what is happening in 16th and 17th century Europe, actually, the translations of both, not only the colonial administrators, even the missionaries were translating. The Catholic missionaries were translating Sanskrit texts and circulating in Europe. So in this context, what comes to America is basically, it comes to this through European route. Most of the time, this idea of Aryan race theory, what we see as a fundamental to the white supremacy, is actually develops if in fact there is this French sociologists and historians who are talking about the three estates, basically the idea of three estates in Europe, particularly in French society, and Ambedkar invokes basically this, how the French society has destroyed this idea of three estates. And the idea of three estates, basically, if you look at, comes from the idea, how much it was drawn from the Sanskrit translations, particularly caste being the very important aspect of differentiating themselves within European society, but also when they're encountering with non-Europeans. And settler colonialism would not have been facilitated but for, that's when, the models of Jim Crow state, what happens is that, the racial purity is dependent on control over women's reproductive sexuality. That's one of the reasons why in fact, the kind of punishments black people have experienced, black men, particularly in Southern America, the most important crime they have done is that having sex with white women. That's a fundamental. And that's what happens is that it is black men who get killed. And in caste punishments, if there is a interracial or intercaste sex, it is man who gets killed, lower caste man, not the upper caste women. It's very important that that's how basically this whole idea of patriarchy and caste purity survives. So in this context, for me, that's one of the reasons why you have to look at 16th, 17th century encounters and what actually the texts are translating. Even for that matter, Britishers, one of the earliest translations were Laws of Manu. If you look at how these things are becoming, Laws of Manu, and then, Mahabharata, the epics, particularly Bhagavad Gita, was very important part of, circular intellectual tradition. So that's why, no wonder white people are very obsessed with Hinduism. The whole idea of this, yoga mat culture comes out of this. Wherever you see, yeah, it's part of that.
Okay, no, thank you. I see Arif's question, and then I think, yes, that question. So Arif, just very quickly, I think actually I didn't fully have clarity on this until we had, so now there is, for some years, for some decades now, there is also an anti-caste movement among Muslims, organized by lower caste or caste-lowered Muslims. So we actually had a speaker at my university from that community, and I suddenly had this clarity on some of the stakes here, which I didn't quite see even when I was writing the book, which is to say that this question of Hindu-Muslim binary has shaped the study of medieval and early modern India, which are the periods in Indian history in which Muslim kings ruled large parts of India. And so there's a lot of the literature, the older literature was Muslims are oppressing Hindus, which is something that is circulating very much in the public sphere today. And the newer literature, at least, from 1960 at least, was no, Muslim kings were not oppressing Hindus, which is absolutely true. Let me clarify that for anyone in the room. There are very exaggerated narratives of Muslim oppression of Hindus in India that are absolutely fabrications. So I completely stand by that, but the field seemed to be stuck on this question of, well, there was tolerance, there was fluidity, there was pluralism, which as I said, I agree with. But what became clear to me, perhaps as a result of the speaker we had, which was that the question, the minoritization of Muslims in the course of, again, the 19th, 20th century in India has led to the erasure of divisions within Muslims, particularly by caste, because there is this constant exhortation to Muslims, again, by those Muslims who are dominant in caste, who are dominant socioeconomically, to say we need to rally together, like we need to stand up together, which is also true. I don't mean to be dismissive of that, but that dynamic has led to a kind of postponing of the caste question among Muslims, which again is not something I directly do in the book. I do talk about, caste among Muslims, like the butchers clearly are Muslim and low caste. But at the same time, I think for me, I realize that why is it that we keep talking about Hindu, Muslim, even though both the Hindu and the Muslim are understood even within the terms of that time through the categories of caste. And so that seemed to me almost like this is in plain sight. Why is it not happening? And now I wonder if that was part of the stakes that I've been riding over this so-called Muslim period in South Asian history. The second one is the role of a particular caste community that is named as Bhangi in pre-colonial records, and that is today a pejorative term. It names caste groups that were engaged in stigmatized occupations of clearing human waste. So I'm talking about, shit and piss and carcasses and dead bodies. And these tasks were, to our modern minds, sort of unhygienic, but in the caste logic, they were also ritually impure. That made these castes hereditarily, even if they stopped doing the work, it was in their body, it was passed on from generation to generation, is a bodily impurity. So I do focus on the Bhangi because I was struck by, I think for me that is where the kind of touchable, untouchable hardness became so clear, because the Bhangi community in this record barely ever come up as litigants, whereas every other community comes with all kinds of disputes, saying, this tax was due to me, I was entitled to this, I didn't get it. But the Bhangis never ever approach the state for any matter, whether it is a dispute or something internal within their community. So they almost seem to be outside the legal, And that was, I felt, something I needed to clearly say. The second thing I found very remarkable was the use of the body of this untouchable community as a means of punishment, where members of this community were asked to spit on someone as a type of punishment. Because when they spat on someone, they transferred their ritual pollution onto that elite caste person, which was, in the eyes of this state, a pretty terrible punishment. The other example of this was to have someone beaten with the shoes worn by members of this community, because in Indian cultural understandings, the feet are particularly not just dirty, but again, sites of ritual impurity. So if you hit someone with a shoe, you're not just hitting them with something that's hygienically dirty, but it's also ritually impure. And I think this kind of transcends to other cultures, like the famous when the journalist threw his shoe at George Bush. I think it was more than just a random object. I think it had symbolic weight. So I think that, to me, again, was something I never saw with any other community, kind of what I call the weaponizing of the Bhangi body as a tool of punishment. So I think for me, the Bhangi then stood at the core of this thing called untouchable, which then I argue is used to kind of condition the order as a whole. Everybody arranges themselves in relation to that core untouchable figure, the Bhangi. Then as to the argument of early modernity, so this is something I think about a lot. I think, here's what my latest thoughts are. They keep changing. My latest thoughts are that the idea of the early modern without that name for the world actually dates back to the literature I cited earlier, which is, which is Frank Perlin, some certain Soviet writers. But this idea that the birth of capitalism is not just something that happens in Europe. We cannot ignore the slavery story. We cannot ignore the colonization of the Americas. We cannot ignore what is happening in Asia. So to me, that literature without the name early modernity still names early modernity. That to me is a very productive way of thinking about the early modern. But there is the named history of the early modern, which at least for South Asia begins circa 1998, I would say. And in that literature, it's a lot about circulating people, circulating objects, circulating texts, encounters between people from 3 different cultures. But other than showing that there are people circulating, there is a curious absence of power, hierarchy, oppression in that vein. And that, I think, that turn in the global literature is much more rooted or much more open to the criticisms that have increasingly been made of the global turn in history, that this is a product of the triumph of the West after the collapse of the Soviet Union and the spread of market ideology and globalization. This is an actual academic article in, I think it was Past and Present, that very starkly says it's not a coincidence that the global turn happens in 1990s. So yeah, and for me, it's not that it is, I wouldn't even say like, okay, maybe that's fine, it could be a useful lens, but I haven't found that early modern thing to be so useful. Like, okay, so people were meeting, so what? You know? So I find this other story of these deep economic connections to be much more interesting, and there I take it to, this is what I have done, it's not my argument, I'm thinking with Sebastian Conrad, who has written this book called What is Global History, who encourages us to think at scales. So for me, what I think, I look at this very local inland polity, is to always consider what could be happening outside this polity, be it at the regional, the subcontinental, or the global scale that is actually affecting what seems to be a local story. So that's what I have taken away as how this thing, which I accept that there is a global early modern, I am on that page, but how does it affect history that's where I go with it. And I will end with a warning from Dipesh Chakrabarty, which is that frequently, and this is also in Sheldon Pollock and a few other scholars, which is there is no shame in pre-modernity, by which I mean that South Asian early modernity or Ottoman early modernity does not have to look like European early modernity. We might be connected in some ways, but it doesn't mean that we also had a public sphere, we also had democracy, we also had a printing press, we also had, we doesn't all have to look the same. So I try to keep that in mind, that for me the argument doesn't end by saying, oh, you had this in the early modern, we have it too, so we are the same. So that is something I would like to keep away from. So that's where I'm at. But thank you.
Thank you so much. I will request.
Thank you so much, Divya and Chinnaiaiah. It was a wonderful talks and wonderful discussion and question answer session after that. So thank you, and thank you so much for joining us. And I hope you enjoyed the India Studies event and the talks. And we will have, I think in my class, I am discussing some of the similar things. So we will follow up on that, on this talk in my class. So thank you so much for coming. Good night.